All right. So with that, let's get started. So the first session that we're going to talk about is what is public forum debate. This is just going over the basics for those of you who have not had any experience with public forum debate before. For those of you who have worked with us a little bit over the course of this semester, some of this might be review, but that's okay because we want to lock in these ideas as firmly as we can to make sure that by the time we reach the debating and judging stage, all of this is second nature to us and we can focus on the arguments rather than the structure. So what is public forum debate? It's also called PF debate or PFD for short. For those of you who are coming from the NTNU English debates or the Cicero debates, it's similar to the non-policy style that you all do in the spring semester. The main difference being that instead of 2 teams per round, there's 1, and there's some differences to the speech order, which I'll get into in a little bit. But in terms of the overall philosophy, think of it as being very, very similar to the non-policy style of debates that you all have been doing so far. So the topics are similar in that we are given a topic for the semester and we debate the general pros and cons without really focusing on the policy details or the step-by-step process of how the resolution would be done. Instead, we're debating the general pros and cons of doing the resolution. So one team who's assigned to defend the pro side of the resolution, or what you have been calling the affirmative, they're called the pro team, and the other, what you have been calling the negative, is called the con team. And as before, teams will be assigned their side in a tournament, so each school has to prepare for both sides of the topic. One of the main structural differences between NTNU English debates and public forum debates is about the burdens or the obligations that the arguments from each side or each team have to meet. And so we call these the burdens of proof and disproof or rejoinder. So the burdens of proof and disproof or rejoinder. The burden of proof is similar to English debates, which you have been doing. And the burden of proof says that in order for an argument to be considered valid, the team that introduces it has to provide some reasoning or some proof behind why the argument is true. So we'll get into this in our second session when Shanna tells you all about what makes up an argument, but it's not enough to just say something or assert that something is true, right? If I want to prove cats are better than dogs, I can't just say cats are better than dogs. I have to provide a reason, or the other team, or I haven't made an argument yet, and the other team doesn't have to respond to what I said. So that's the burden of proof. Pretty simple. To make an argument, you have to provide some proof for it. Now, the burden of disproof is where things get a little bit different. Under NTNU English debates, the general thing that each team has been doing is you're trying to give an overall more persuasive speech. You're trying to present the best arguments for your side, maybe respond to a couple of things your opponents have said. And that's quite different from public forum, because in public forum, you have to respond to everything your opponent said. Otherwise, it's considered true for the rest of the debate. So the burden of proof says you have to provide some reason for why your argument is true. But once you've done that, unless your opponent provides a response or a disproof or a rejoinder, that argument is considered true because your opponent has failed their burden to disprove your argument. So in my example, if I say cats are better than dogs with no explanation, that's not enough. I have not met my burden of proof. If I say cats are better than dogs because they're cuddlier, I have now provided a reason. I have met my burden of proof. Now, my opponent has to provide a response. Otherwise, that argument is considered true for the rest of the debate. Any questions about that broad idea so far?
So in another term, you might say that they are dropping the issue, meaning that they're letting that one go because they're going after other ones. Now, is it possible, or is this something later where you can pick it up later? Like, oh yeah, going back to, I didn't have time to discuss that one. And so I'm not sure of the public forum rounds, but I'm sure we'll get to that later.
Yeah, good question. So if you're familiar with the vocabulary of dropping an argument, then that is also the phrasing that is used in public forum debates. So if you concede an opponent's argument or you don't provide a response, that means you've dropped their argument. Or if you say something in an early speech and then you don't bring it up in a later speech, then you've dropped that argument or you're choosing not to focus on it. Sometimes this is okay to do, right? As we'll get into in a little bit, part of the structure of the debate is you kind of have to focus in on your best arguments towards the end. You can't keep talking about everything you said. So to some degree, this will happen on purpose, but there is also a consequence to making a mistake, which is if you miss something by mistake, then it becomes true and you can't really come back to it as long as the other team continues extending it through their speeches. Good question.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm Caleb, and I would like to try to clarify. So how immediate would the response have to be before the judges believe that the a side has dropped as a particular case or stance?
So it depends on when the argument was introduced. I'll get into this when I explain the structure of a round in a second. But it'll be the simplest way to think of it is actually I'll try to embed the answer as I explain the structure of the round, and then if you still have this question, come back to me and I will try to clarify.
All right, no worries. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So before I do that, though, I want to briefly make a note about what public forum debate topics are. So like I said, these are similar to the non-policy topics you've been debating. In the US style of public forum, the topic actually changes many times every single year. So the topic will change every 1 to 2 months. And the idea of that is to get students to talk about a variety of different current events issues. For our purposes, we will only be changing it once per semester. So there will be a fall topic and there will be a spring topic. And the topics usually focus on some current events issue, and sometimes they talk about policy, sometimes they talk about philosophy. For this semester, this is the topic that we are going to be using. For those of you following along on your notes, it is written down there. It is resolved in Taiwan, social media is beneficial for democratic values. So the pro side will be saying that it is in fact beneficial, and the con side will be saying that it is not beneficial. So this is the structure of a public forum debate, and I'll break each of these lines down in much more detail. But the general pattern is that teams are taking turns, and in each speech, you are using your logic, your evidence, and comparisons to prove that your arguments are better than your opponent's arguments. So the pro will give the first speech, the con will then give their response, and in between each set of speeches, there is a crossfire, which is sort of similar to a cross-examination. And I'll go into what each of these speeches is supposed to accomplish in a second. So constructive is the first speech. And a constructive speech is kind of like the case speech or the introductory speech for those of you coming from the NTNU non-policy debate. This speech is 4 minutes long, and the purpose of it is for teams to simply introduce their cases. Since this is not a speech where you have to respond to what your opponent said, this is a speech that you should write in advance. Now, to Caleb's question, so you can see on my last slide here, there are two constructives, right? The pro gives theirs first, and then the con gives theirs. So does the con have to respond to the pro constructive? No, they do not. So the constructive speeches are just introductory speeches. You don't have to talk about what your opponents have said yet. All you need to do is lay out your case. So you have 4 minutes to do that. And this is the easiest speech in the debate, or it should be, because you've prepped it in advance and you don't have to adapt on the fly to anything your opponents are doing. Questions about the constructive? Okay. Oh, someone's unmuted. Oh, there we go. Oops. Okay. All right. After the constructive, we have the crossfire, and the crossfire is, like I said, similar
Anthony,
to a crossing. Oh.
Real quick, Caleb,
Yep.
were you clapping or were you trying to raise your hand?
Oh, no. I was absolutely clapping.
Okay, just double checking. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you.
Yep, same here, just clapping.
All right. So crossfire is 3 minutes long, and it's similar to a cross-examination in that there are questions and there are answers. The difference from cross-examination is there is not a dedicated period of time for one team to ask one other team questions. Instead, the question and answer periods are combined, and the two teams take turns asking and answering questions. So one person will go first and ask their question, then the other person will answer, and then once they're done answering, they will kind of reply back and ask their question of the first person. And you can kind of think of this like a table tennis match, right? It's like a volley, you send it in one direction and then they return the ball, and then they hit their own shot at their opponent, right? So you're taking turns. This is the part of the debate where teams will usually request to see evidence that their opponents have read if they would like to look at it a little bit more closely. So if in the constructive, your opponent cited a piece of evidence that you have some doubts about, in the crossfire, you can ask them to please share it, and then they will share it with you and you can have a look at it. In US public forum debate, there are two different kinds of crossfire. There is normal crossfire, where only some debaters get to talk, and there's grand crossfire, where all debaters get to talk. Don't worry about that, because in our modified version, we are focusing on teamwork for all of the different speeches. So just as before, just as in the English debates, both in policy and in non-policy, we are encouraging all teams and all members of each team to participate in every speech. So this is true for the constructive, for the rebuttals, and for the crossfires. Anyone from either team can chime in to ask or answer a question if they would like. And the goal of this is to make it easier for people so that we aren't kind of putting one person on the spot for all 3 of the minutes.
And in other debate leagues, they often call it, I guess, open crossfire, because you can agree to that before the round begins. And so in ours, it's just going to be set that it's already designed to be open crossfire, similar to grand crossfire, but in each round, correct?
Yep, exactly right. Questions about the crossfire?
One quick question. For the crossfire, who decides who gets to ask the first question? That's something I always get asked whenever I have to judge them.
Yeah, so we're actually going to do a whole session on crossfire. We got an expert guest lecturer. They're going to go into the nitty-gritty of all of this, and they're going to practice this with all of you. But
I'll hold off.
My short answer for now, it's a good question. My short answer for now is crossfire is different than cross-examination in that if teams are being rude to one another or trying to talk over each other, it does devolve into chaos pretty fast. So the overall answer for all of these questions is there are norms. We want to be polite to one another. Usually the pro will ask the first question, or one side will say, would you like the first question? And we'll do a demonstration debate so you can see kind of how this all plays out in practice. But yeah, the general answer is we want to be nice and negotiate this as best we can. Okay. So now that we've got the crossfire, so far we've had a constructive, we've introduced our arguments, we've had a crossfire, we've asked and answered some questions. Now we have the rebuttal. The rebuttal is also 4 minutes long. And the rebuttal is when teams start to introduce their responses to their opponent's case. Now, again, back to Caleb's question, there's 2 rebuttals. So does the con rebuttal have to respond to the pro rebuttal yet? No, the con rebuttal does not have to respond to the pro rebuttal. Although you can, if you have extra time and you feel like doing so, the obligation to respond in the next speech does not kick in yet. So the first half of the debate is very simple. You have a speech to introduce your stuff, and then you have a speech to attack your opponent's stuff.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. And I will not re-explain crossfires every time they come up. So I will just say there's another crossfire period. It is the same as the first one. Then we have the summary speech. So the first part of the debate, very easy. The summary is where the debate starts getting a little bit more difficult, because the summary speech is really where debaters start having to think on their feet and come up with their own applications of arguments they made earlier. It's also a shorter speech. So remember, the first 2 speeches were each 4 minutes long. The summary is only 3 minutes long. And not only that, but you have to kind of cover the content from your opponent's constructive and the content from their rebuttal. So you kind of have to answer 8 minutes worth of arguments in just 3 minutes. This is why what I mentioned to Nate at the very beginning is true, which is we can't go forward with all of our strategic options. We can't pursue all of our different arguments. We have to have a strategy for how we will use our limited time and resources to win the debate. And we have to focus down to just talking about the best arguments. So this speech is also a little tricky, because this is where that burden of rejoinder business really starts to kick in. And after this speech, let's say I'm the pro, the con made an argument in their rebuttal against my case, and I don't answer it in my summary. At this point, if that happens, I'm stuck with that argument. I have dropped the argument. So at this point, this is where we start having to respond to everything that our opponents say. Otherwise, we admit that it is true. Now, again, usually we will have lots of different options, right? We might have 2 contentions in our constructive, and we might decide to focus on one of them and not talk about the other one anymore. We might decide to drop one of our contentions, right? So, and we would do this for strategic purposes. So it's okay if we make some concessions, but this is where our choices kind of get locked in. If we don't go for something, if we drop an argument here, we can't bring it up again. So we have to make sure that those arguments we do care about, we cover thoroughly and respond to every objection that our opponents make. Yes, Nate.
So until this summary, you still could pick up something. Like if you didn't bring it up during your rebuttal speech, you're saying that I still could respond to something that I skipped over in my rebuttal speech, but it must have been something fairly critical. Otherwise, I can no longer respond to it ever, like in the final focus.
Well, so in the summary and in the last speech, which is called the final focus, the teams are also not supposed to bring up new arguments. So if you didn't mention something at all earlier in the debate, right? So if your opponent has a whole contention in their constructive that your rebuttal didn't respond to, bringing up new arguments in the summary about that contention, that's not advisable. You should probably not do that. You should probably respond in the rebuttal. However, in your rebuttal speech, you don't have to re-explain your constructive. Like I said, all you need to do in your rebuttal is attack your opponent. So you are kind of skipping over your constructive in the rebuttal speech, but you can obviously still bring it up again in the summary. So short answer is, beginning of the debate, very easy. You talk about your stuff, then you talk about your opponent's stuff. Then in the summary, that's where we start to take the arguments we've already introduced and compare them, resolve them, press our attack against our opponent, and defend our own stuff. It might make sense to think about the debate in two parts, right? And then this first part, that's the introducing arguments piece. And then the second part is the actual debating and comparison and hashing it out piece. Questions about any of that?
I'm sorry. I would like to try to recap to make sure that I got everything straight. So in the constructive speech or case presentation, whatever it's called, it's where they present their pre-written speech, and then in the rebuttal is where they focus on the attacking the opposing side, and then for the summary, this is where they defend. So it's like attack. So it's present, attack, defend. Yes.
With almost, so with one exception. So you're exactly right about the constructive and the rebuttal, but in the summary, you don't just defend your stuff, you also press your attack on your opponent's stuff.
Okay, so okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So for example, if the pro summary responds to the con rebuttal, then in the con summary, you would not only respond to the pro rebuttal, but you would also respond to the pro's responses to your rebuttal to kind of push your own rebuttal forward, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure if I don't understand what the opponent say, what should I do?
So that's part of what should happen in the Crossfire. In the Crossfire, you can ask not just argumentative questions, but also clarification questions. So that's always something that you can use that time for. The other solution, and I'll come to this in a little bit, but there's also prep time that is spread throughout the debate, just like before. So between some of these speeches, there will be some amount of prep time. The reason I haven't talked about this yet is because the exact timing of it is not entirely finalized at this point, is my understanding. But you'll have something like 2 minutes in between each of these sets of speeches to think about what your opponent is saying, talk to your teammates. Hopefully they understood something you didn't, or vice versa, and then you can clear up some of that confusion. And then, of course, the third solution is to just kind of do your best, and we'll provide some techniques and shortcuts that you can do to make sure that whatever you're saying, even if it's not 100% on point, you'll at least land in the ballpark of what your opponent is talking about. Remembering that if you didn't understand what your opponent said, there's a good chance the judge didn't understand it either. So hopefully that'll bail you out a little bit. But there's some layers that you can use to address that situation. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Sorry. So I can get the answer I get from Crossfire, and I pull it into rebuttal or a summary. Like Crossfire is a thing that provides some information that I can put into my rebuttal and summary. Is that correct?
Yeah, and again, we'll go into more detail about this in that dedicated session, but you're absolutely correct. The Crossfire itself, although it's very important, is not a speech in the same way as these other speeches are, right? So if you only responded to an argument during the Crossfire, but you didn't bring it up in your speech, that doesn't count for the burden of disproof or the burden of rejoinder. So you're exactly right. You would use the Crossfire to make a point, to get some information, to set up an argument, and then you would use your speech to actually build on that and then make the actual argument you were setting up, or use the information you obtained.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay, And then there's another crossfire after this. This is the last crossfire in the debate. The one thing I'll say about the later crossfires is, while they're the same in how they're structured, the content of them should be different. So the first crossfire, you should focus on the constructives. The second crossfire, you should focus on the rebuttals. And the third crossfire, ideally, you would focus on the summary, because you kind of need to use that time to deal with the new arguments and the new comparisons and the new developments that are being made. Okay, and then the last speech in the debate is called the final focus. This speech is just 2 minutes long. So what I said about the last speech, about making choices and focusing on your best arguments, is especially true for the final focus. The point of the final focus is for you to make your closing argument. It's kind of your final pitch for why you should win the debate. And you kind of make your last comparisons, you continue pressing your best attacks against your opponent, but you really have to be ruthlessly efficient and extremely selective about what arguments make it to the final focus, because this is the last impression you make for the judge. So you want to make sure you're leaving off on your best foot. Yes, Evangeline.
Hi, I'm Evangeline. I want to ask, so compared to summary, this one is more like whipping in the Asian parliamentary and British parliamentary debate, right?
So I'm not super familiar with Asian parliamentary or British parliamentary, so I'm not the best equipped to provide you with a comparison on that front. I guess one way to think of it is, so for the English debates that I've judged based on my understanding, the summary and final focus speech are kind of like the second speech in English non-policy split in half. So you have the final focus, which is where you do your top level framing and your kind of meta description of what's happening in the round. And then you have your summary, which is more where you get into the nitty gritty and you're setting up those final comparisons. Shanna is familiar with those two styles, and she says that you are correct. So we will go with that also. Okay. Prep time. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Prep time works in exactly the same way. It's time that debaters can use to prepare their speeches. And depending on the exact event that you're doing, so the reason I bring this up is that some of you may be interested in competing in a qualifier to debate at the US national tournament. There's actually a public forum qualifier for Taiwan, where the best couple of teams from Taiwan get to go compete at the US national tournament, which is a lot of fun. So that's why I'm bringing this up, is because it works a little bit differently if you're interested in doing that. But prep time will work in one of two ways. Either it'll work the way you've experienced it before, which is it's pre-assigned. There are certain times, before the rebuttal, you get 2 minutes. Before the summary, you get 2 minutes or something like that. And you can use that time to prepare your speeches. And in the US, there is actually a slightly different system, which is that each team, or the pro and the con, will each get a certain amount of total time, and they can spend it whenever they want in whatever quantity they want throughout the round. So in US public forum, each side has 4 minutes, and before or after any speech, you can declare, I'm the pro, I want to use some prep time. That'll start the clock from 4. It'll tick down until you say you are done using prep time. And that gives you a little more flexibility. Maybe you don't need so much prep for the rebuttal, so you can bank some for later in the debate. Or maybe the opponent has a contention you've never seen before, so you need more time for the rebuttal, so you can use more time then. For our modified version, we'll be using pre-assigned times, but for those of you who want to debate in the US, just so you're aware, this flexible time version also exists.
Sometimes with a flexible time one, you may actually tell the judge, I want to use 30 seconds or I want to use a minute. And then they try to let you know when that minute's up and you can continue on. But yeah, you're limited as a pool. One major mistake that I've seen for that would be like if the pro team is saying, all right, we're going to use 1 minute. And then the con team is like, okay, we want to use a minute. I'm like, well, then wait for the pro team to finish their minute. Otherwise, what are you trying to do? Burn through both of your time at the same time, which is illogical. Just FYI.
Yeah, that's a good point. In both of these, once one team is preparing, both teams can prepare. So during the pre-assigned times, if you have 2 minutes to prepare, then both teams can use that. Or in the flexible times, if the pro team says, I want to use some prep time, the con should be using that time to prepare as well. Good point. Okay. The last major difference, and there's you all have been exposed to equivalents of this or things that are similar to this, but I just want to introduce the public forum terminology or the language that is often used. And that is this idea of framework. And framework is basically how the judge should decide the debate. How the judge should decide the debate. It's the rule the judge should use to determine who should win. And that could be broad. It could be a whole ethical system, right? It could be who saves the most lives should win. It could be who behaves morally should win. It could be whose side of the topic fulfills an ethical duty the best should win, right? So if the pro side is using a number of lives framework and the con side is using an ethical duty framework, right? There might be an extra layer to the debate, which is the con side will give their reasons for why the judge should vote for whoever fulfills an ethical duty, and the pro will push their framework about saving the most lives, just as an example. On our topic, which remember is about social media being beneficial for democratic values in Taiwan, that actually narrows the framework discussion a little bit for our purposes, because the topic tells us what end goal the judge is trying to achieve with their ballot, which is democratic values. The topic says the judge has to vote for the side that is the best for democratic values, right? So on this topic, the framework debate will be pretty narrow. So it'll be, oh, maybe the most important democratic value is informed voting, or maybe it's civil rights, or maybe it's activism, right? So all of those are potential framework arguments that the teams will use to try to get the judge to vote for their side instead of their opponent. So to recap, major differences from English non-policy, which you all are aware of. We have one team per side instead of two. So there's one pro team and one con team. There are more speeches. There are crossfires. Crossfires are different than cross-examinations because you take turns. And you have these burdens of proof and rejoinder. So proof, which is the same, and rejoinder, which is a little bit different, because your obligation to respond to every single thing that your opponent says is a little bit more strongly enforced and more impactful for deciding the winner of the debate. Questions about all of that stuff? Nate.
Yeah. So just the framework, would that be something that is brought up throughout, or is that typically something that is brought up more in the final focus to like say, hey, judges, under this condition, we're the ones who win? Because normally I've heard that in the final focus or possibly the first constructive speech, but not so much throughout the other two speeches. Is that correct?
So bringing it up for the first time in the final focus is not a good idea, because again, we don't want to be bringing up completely new arguments in the final focus. And the reason for this is obvious, right? We don't want the second final focus speaker to just be able to say completely new stuff and the other team wouldn't have a chance to respond to it, right? So new arguments not allowed in the second half of the debate. So if you want to make framework a big part of your strategy, it's usually a good idea to state to make your framework argument in the constructive speech and to respond to your opponent's framework argument in the rebuttal speech. And then it would kind of go forward from there using the same argument structure as everything else. Yes.
Sorry, could you go back to the slide of the framework? I don't, because I know nothing about debating. I just want to know, is the framework is like limitation, like the limitation of your topic of this debate? Like we should mention, or we should set out this limitation in the beginning of the debate. Is it like that?
So it's not quite the same as the topic, because the topic is determined by the resolution, right, which is about social media and democratic values. I think what you mean by your question is this something that the teams need to agree on at the beginning, and then everyone kind of debates on that ground? So like everyone agrees saving the most lives is the most important, and then that's the framework for the debate. And that's not how it works. So the topic is determined at the beginning, and it's the topic for all of the debates, and it's what all the debates will be about. Framework is something that the debaters disagree about throughout the debate. So let's say I give a speech that says social media is good for democratic values, and my reason is activism. And my framework argument is activism is the most important democratic value, right? And then the con stands up and says, no, social media is bad for democratic values. It spreads fake news. And having informed voters is the most important democratic value, right? So we would have our debate about the merits of each of our contentions, but then throughout the debate, we would also continue to disagree about which democratic value is more important, informed voters or activism.
So could I chime in for a second there with like your earlier example of cats versus dogs, which one's better? So if we made it simple and said, which is better, cats versus dogs, one person could say, well, the framework for dogs being better is that they can do more jobs to help people out. And the other person says, well, but the importance of having a pet is that you don't have to give detailed care over it because it can take care of itself. So cats are better. Now they're arguing over the usefulness of a dog versus the ease of owning a cat. And therefore, there's two different frameworks that people are battling for to convince the judge which is actually better. And in both sense, they're both correct that one's better than the other, but it's under different framework. And so the overarching theme, meaning cats are better than dogs, now they have to define under which framework better. What does that mean? Does it mean useful or does it mean convenient? And so that is what they're going for. So even though, we could get into normally more difficult topics than cats versus dogs, like he was doing as far as democratic values, it's still just how are you defining the idea that we're trying to argue over? And that, I think, is what the framework generally is. Is that correct?
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Anthony, I would like to ask, based on this slide, it says framework is how the judge should decide the debate. So we're looking at the topic and then deciding whether it could be broad or narrow, or is it the debaters that are defining whether it's broad or narrow? Who's defining it?
So the broad and narrow thing are just different kinds of framework arguments that could be made.
Okay.
But what I mean by broad or narrow is kind of what Nate was getting at with his cats or dogs example is another way to think about it, right? So useful animal versus animal that you don't have to take care of, right? So those are two different frameworks for deciding whether a cat is better or a dog is better. So how the judge should decide the debate is saying, well, should the judge decide who's better based on which animal requires less work, or based on which animal is more useful. If the judge should decide the debate based on which is more useful, the judge might vote for the dog. But if they want to decide the debate based on which animal is less work, they would vote for the cat.
Okay.
It's kind of
Thank
it's another way to think of it is it's the criterion, or it's the measuring stick that you use to
Mhm.
decide which argument has more value or more merit.
So as judges, do we need to have a consensus where each judge is totally fine on its own, independent?
Debaters are
of-
going to convince you that you should listen to their framework.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if I
Sorry,
could
go
just so if I could just intervene real quick. The way I like to explain it, and maybe this will help some students too. So the resolution sets out a really large area of discussion, right? And in 4 minutes, it's impossible for debaters to talk about absolutely everything that's in a resolution, right? It's impossible to talk about every single democratic value that exists. So what the framework is there for is to say, okay, look, we're going to take this really huge topic, or, no matter what it is, and we're going to
Okay.
narrow it down to this perspective. Right. So if you look in the chat, I put in that maybe the pro says that for the most important democratic value is freedom of speech. And so they argue about why that is. What does freedom of speech allow? Why is it good for democracy? All of these things. Why does social media create freedom of speech? The con team could say, well, actually, the most important democratic value is an informed citizenry. Right. And then in their constructive, all they focus on is why an informed citizenry is good and why social media is bad for that value. And then the rest of the debate, hopefully, will be back and forth of the debaters trying to convince you which side is correct. So then you're kind of asking about judging. In American public forum debate, judging, however many are on the judging panel, is an odd number. And it's just whoever gets the most yes votes is the one that wins. In TNU, they're going to be keeping the collaboration aspect, but where you still as a judge will make your own decision, right? And then you'll decide who gets, I think it's out of 3 points, who will get 3, 2, or 1 points based on how well the actual debate happens. Does that answer or help out, Caleb?
Yeah, it does, because we're trying, how to call this? As judges, sometimes they'll ask you, like, is it because like your standards are different for each round and stuff? And so like, I wanted to make sure that I am on the same page as you guys are, because I as judge, we get these questions, or sometimes, for lack of a better wording, accusations. And I wanted to make sure how I wanted to explain to them, and so I wouldn't be in muddy waters. But
yeah,
so one of the things I always tell judges to remind them is, one, you're the judge, you're always correct. Doesn't matter. You're right. Like, you're signing the ballot.
Right.
So that's what I always tell all my debaters. And then the other one is judges, I always remind debaters, judges are humans too. And we're going to see things differently no matter how well it's explained to us in a debate round. So I always explain it to debaters that are not happy with my decision, that, I'm always like, I'm really sorry that I didn't vote for you, but I feel like you did not do your job of convincing me. So in future rounds, here's how you could do better. And I don't worry about if students get mad at me personally. Like, they grow up and they forget it. What are they going to do? They're
technically,
I mean, I like them, right? Like, I love students, but if they're unhappy about 1 or 2 rounds in their entire life, like, meh.
Yeah, I also wanted to just add in that, so on the specific issue of, are you judging consistently, is something that you asked about. So like, are you using different standards for each debate, right? Your framework, or how you're judging the debate, should be different from debate to debate, right? There would be something wrong if you were deciding every debate based on the same criteria, because you're judging different debates, right?
Okay.
You're being told to vote on different things. You're being given different values or different measuring sticks or different frameworks to
True.
measure the arguments against each other. So if you had your own set of standards that you just brought to every debate and applied no matter what the debaters said, that's definitely worse than judging based on what the debaters say in each debate, right? So
Right.
at the end of the day, you get to decide based on whatever you want. It's the debater's job to convince you. We have some standards and norms for how we evaluate arguments and for what expectations we have for what debaters need to do and for what each side needs to, accomplish, like the burdens of proof and rejoinder.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's all about convincing you that their side is better, and whoever does that more effectively is the one that wins, and that's how it should be. Because at
Okay.
the end of the day, part of what the value of debate is that we're training people to convince other humans. We're not training people to execute a formula. We're not training people to check a box or, appeal to a calculator. We're trying to train persuasive, critical, analytical thinkers. And that's the way we do that. Nate's point is exactly right. It's what we call blank slate or tabula rasa judging. Is you don't bring your own ideas about judging to the table. You judge what you judge, and you vote based on what is argued in front of you, and that's perfectly normal. And if debaters are unhappy about it, they should refine their arguments for next time and take what you tell them as advice
Mhm.
and use that to improve.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony and Shanna.
Great question. Yeah, this is kind of the underlying philosophy behind all of debate, which is why we gave kind of an extended answer here. This theme will continually keep coming up and cropping up in a lot of different contexts. So it's good that you asked this at the outset. Yes.
Sorry, just want to make sure if I didn't misunderstand. So framework is this something like you should, in order to get more favor from the judges, you have to pulling each other, like I have a different framework from my opponent. So we should use this framework to try to get more point from the judges. Or the framework is something like we have to discuss before we start our debates that no, this is the framework we're going to work on, and no, and yes, this is the framework we should stay in. So so just which one is it? Is it like framework? Is it like the rules that we should be talked about before the debate, or is it like a skill or a way that you could get extra points from the judges?
Yeah, so usually the two sides are not going to agree about a framework. So you as a team, so you should absolutely be talking to, debaters should talk to their coaches and should talk to each other, and you should decide on a framework to use for your side. But you and your opponent are usually not going to agree on a framework. And that's totally fine. And part of the debate is debating about which side has a better way of deciding which side of the resolution is true. Sometimes you will agree about a framework. So, for example, if I stood up and said dogs are better than cats because they are friendlier, and the con stood up and said, no, we agree friendliness is what matters, but actually cats are friendlier, then we've agreed about a framework. We've agreed the way to decide the best pet is who's the friendliest. And now we're comparing cats and dogs based on who's friendlier, right? So sometimes that will happen, but usually there will not be agreement like that, and that is totally fine. Good question. All right, any more questions about anything that I have said? I believe this is my last slide. Yes.
And I'm pretty sure there's going to be plenty of these things reoccurring throughout the 3 days. So if we miss something at this moment, this is the introductory, which you're doing an awesome job with that. So covered a lot there.
Yeah, we will definitely be revisiting a lot of this. And if you, yeah, the schedule that I sent out kind of lays out what the broad sessions that we're going to be doing are. The theme of today is we're going to be talking about how to make an argument and how to meet your burden of proof and how to meet the burden of rejoinder. Tomorrow we'll go into more detail about some specific speeches and speech techniques, in particular Crossfire, and how to research. And then on the last day, we will be doing a lot of speaking and debating ourselves, applying some of the skills we learned.